holding a textbook so worn that the cover has separated from the spine and is being held together by two rubber bands he found in the break room trash. The parking lot light above him flickers every 40 seconds. He has learned to read in the dark intervals. He has learned to keep going when the light goes out. His name is Ernesto Vasquez, and nobody, not the cook who calls him, "Hey you," not the manager who has mispronounced his name for 11 months, not the men who share his 2-bedroom apartment 6 bodies deep, nobody knows what he is building in the dark. But we need to go back, because the story of a man sitting on a milk crate at 2:47 a.m. with a falling apart textbook doesn't begin in a Chicago parking lot. It begins in a kitchen in Oaxaca, Mexico, where a boy watches his father count coins on a table for the 3rd night in a row, and learns, without anyone telling him directly, that love alone cannot feed a family. Ernesto was born the second of 4 children in San Marcos Tlapazola, a small village outside of Oaxaca City in southern Mexico. His father, Rodrigo, was a bricklayer. His mother, Consuelo, made and sold tamales from a cart. She pushed 3 kilometers to the market every morning before the sun came up. They were not poor in the way that breaks people immediately. They were poor in the slow, grinding way, the kind that wears you down like water on stone, so gradually you almost don't notice until one day you look at yourself and realize something essential has been eroded. Rodrigo Vasquez was a proud man. He had strong hands and a wide laugh, and he loved his children with the kind of love that doesn't know how to say itself out loud, so it shows up instead in small acts, in the extra tortilla placed on Ernesto's plate when no one was looking, in the way he'd walk to the back of the house when he cried so the children wouldn't see. He wanted Ernesto in school. He talked about school the way some men talk about God, with a reverence that admitted he himself had never really been inside the thing he worshipped. Ernesto was smart, his teachers said so. He was the kind of student who finished his work and then sat quietly watching others, not out of arrogance, but because his mind was always moving faster than the lesson. By 14, he was doing calculations in his head that his teacher had to verify on paper. Numbers made sense to him in a way that the world around him often didn't. They were honest. They didn't change based on who you were or what your last name was. 2 + 2 was 4 whether you were the governor's son or the bricklayer's boy. But at 16, the math of his family's life overtook the math of his future. His father fell from scaffolding on a construction job, not fatally, but badly enough. A fractured wrist, 2 cracked ribs, 3 months of no work. The coins on the table got fewer. Consuelo's tamale cart couldn't carry the weight of 6 people. Ernesto's younger brother Miguel started having headaches that the village clinic couldn't explain, and the city hospital would cost money they didn't have. Ernesto dropped out of school on a Tuesday. He didn't make a speech about it. He didn't cry about it in front of anyone. He simply didn't go on Wednesday and instead went to a construction site and asked for work. He was 16 years old, broad-shouldered for his age, and he looked the foreman in the eye with such quiet certainty that the man hired him without asking for his age. He worked construction for 2 years. Then a cousin, his mother's sister's boy, a man named Fortunato who had been in the United States for 6 years and spoke about it, the way people speak about a place they're not entirely sure was real, called and said there was work in Chicago. Real work, restaurant work. He said you could make in 1 week what took a month in Oaxaca. Ernesto was 18. He told his parents he was going. His father didn't speak for a long time. Then he said, "Don't forget who you are when you get there." His mother packed him 3 days of food in a bag and held his face in her hands and looked at him the way only mothers can, like she was memorizing him, like she was afraid she was seeing him for the last time. She might have been right. The journey north is not a story for the faint of heart, and Ernesto would never tell it fully to anyone, not even years later when he had the words and the distance to do so. It took 22 days. It cost him the $300 his father had borrowed from a neighbor, money the family would spend the next year repaying. There were moments in the desert in Arizona when he understood, in his body rather than his mind, what it meant to be completely alone in the world. When he crossed, he had $47 left. He had the phone number of Fortunato's landlord on a piece of paper. He had a change of clothes in a plastic bag. He had nothing else. Chicago in January was something for which no amount of description could have prepared him. He had never been cold like that. The cold in Oaxaca at night was a discomfort. The cold that hit him when he stepped off the bus in Chicago was a presence, a physical force, aggressive and indifferent, that seemed to be informing him immediately that this city had no idea he had arrived and cared even less. Fortunato lived in Pilsen, the Mexican neighborhood on the lower west side of Chicago, in a 2-bedroom apartment that housed, at the time of Ernesto's arrival, 7 men. Ernesto became the 8th. He slept on the living room floor for the first 2 months on a blanket he found in a Goodwill bag someone had left in the hallway. Fortunato got him the job at Rosie's Diner within a week. It was a 24-hour diner on the edge of Bridgeport, the kind of place where the coffee never stopped and the smell of grease lived in the walls. Ernesto's job was to wash dishes. He worked the overnight shift, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., because that's what was available and because he would take anything. The head dishwasher was a man named Dale, a 52-year-old from Alabama who had been washing dishes in various Chicago establishments for 20 years and had developed an entire philosophy about the work that he would share whether you want to hear it or not. Dale spoke to Ernesto on the first night in the careful, loud way that people sometimes speak to those they assume don't understand, not mean-spirited, just ignorant. Ernesto understood more English than anyone realized. He had been listening to American television on Fortunato's second-hand TV for 3 weeks before starting work, absorbing it the way he absorbed everything, quietly and completely. He chose not to correct Dale's assumption immediately. He needed to understand the landscape before he revealed himself in it. The work was not hard in the way that construction was hard. It didn't break your body the same way, but it was relentless in a different fashion. The dishes never stopped. The kitchen was loud and hot and steam-filled, and everyone in it was moving with a kind of controlled urgency that left no room for stillness. Ernesto learned the rhythm in 3 days. By the end of the first week, Dale had stopped speaking loudly at him and started simply speaking. "You're fast," Dale said one night, watching Ernesto clear a backlog in 20 minutes that normally took 40. "Where'd you learn to work like that?" "My father," Ernesto said. It was the first full sentence he'd spoken at work. Dale looked at him for a moment, surprised, then nodded slowly. "Good man, your father," he said, though he had no way of knowing that. It was the right thing to say anyway. The first year in Chicago was about survival, and Ernesto was methodical about it the way he was methodical about everything. He sent money home every 2 weeks, a fixed amount, $200, which he calculated to be the minimum his family needed and the maximum he could spare. He ate 1 real meal a day at the diner during his break, whatever the cook would give him, usually something left over from what the customers didn't finish. He walked to work instead of taking the bus when the temperature was above 10 degrees, because the bus cost $2.50 each way, and that was $25 a week, and that was more than he could justify. He was not unhappy. That is important to understand. He wasn't performing joy he didn't feel, but he wasn't drowning in misery either. He was focused. There is a particular kind of peace that comes from knowing exactly what you are doing and why, and Ernesto had that. He was here because his family needed him to be. He was washing dishes because that was the job available. He was sending $200 home every 2 weeks because that was the math of love. But something started happening about 8 months in. A slow, uncomfortable feeling that he recognized, but hadn't expected to feel so strongly. It was the feeling of his mind going unused. He would finish a stack of dishes and stand for a moment in the steam, and his brain, which had once been the fastest thing in his village school, which had calculated angles on construction sites before the engineers confirmed them, his brain would reach for something to grip and find nothing there. And in that emptiness, something uncomfortable lived. It wasn't quite despair. It was more like the feeling of a muscle atrophying, like watching yourself disappear in slow motion. He started noticing things at the diner that he hadn't paid attention to before. He watched the owner, a heavyset Greek-American man named Stavros, who came in every Monday morning with a folder of papers that Ernesto eventually realized were financial documents. He watched Stavros sit at the back booth and go through receipts and invoices with an expression of concentrated frustration, pushing numbers around a yellow legal pad, occasionally muttering to himself. One night from across the pass-through, Ernesto watched Stavros make a calculation error, a simple transposition, a $400 discrepancy, and the man didn't catch it. He circled a number on his pad as if it were correct and moved on. Ernesto didn't say anything, but something woke up in him that night, something that had been very still for a long time. He started going to the library on his days off. The Harold Washington Library on State Street, the great enormous building with the owls on the roof that still surprised him every time he saw it. He walked in the first time and stood in the lobby for almost 3 minutes, just looking around, feeling something he couldn't quite name, something between wonder and grief, because this was the largest collection of knowledge he had ever been inside of, and he had arrived here at 20 years old having never been allowed to stay in school long enough to deserve it. He found the ESL section first, then the GED preparation books. He checked out 2, carried them home under his arm, and that night, while 6 other men slept around him, he lay on his floor blanket under the light that came in through the window from the street and read until 4 a.m. He was already working 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. He started going to the library from 2 p.m. to 8 p.m. on his days off. He started reading on his breaks at the diner, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever he could steal. The textbooks became his constant companions. He kept them in a bag he brought to work, buried under a spare apron. He was not embarrassed about what he was doing, exactly, but he had learned enough about the specific cruelty of mockery to understand that some dreams need to be protected while they're still small. He took the GED exam 14 months after arriving in Chicago. He sat in a testing center in a plastic chair surrounded by people half his age and felt the strangest combination of terror and calm he had ever experienced. He passed. Not barely, he passed with a score in the 97th percentile in mathematics and the 84th overall. He sat in the parking lot afterward and called his mother from a prepaid phone and told her. She cried. He didn't. He saved his emotions for the walk home, and somewhere on the bridge over the Chicago River, he stopped and looked at the water and let himself feel it, the full weight of it, the years it had taken, the cost, and he allowed himself exactly 4 minutes of private celebration. Then he crossed the bridge and kept walking. The GED was the first step, but Ernesto was not a man who celebrated steps. He was a man who looked at steps and then immediately looked up to see how many more remained. He had a plan. He had been forming it for months, testing it against itself, looking for weaknesses. He wanted to become a certified public accountant. The reasons were both personal and practical. Numbers were what he understood. Accounting was the language of money, and money, not in the greedy sense but in the structural sense, was what separated the people who had choices from the people who didn't. He had watched his family not have choices his entire life. He intended to change that equation. For them and for the community of people he saw around him every day in Pilsen, immigrants who worked twice as hard and were twice as likely to be cheated because they didn't understand the financial systems they were operating in. To become a CPA, he needed 150 college credit hours and to pass 4 sections of the uniform CPA examination. The education alone would take years. The exam was one of the hardest professional licensing tests in the United States, with pass rates hovering around 50% for each section. Most people who took it had full-time student schedules and dedicated study programs and still struggled. Ernesto had a dishwashing shift, a borrowed blanket on a floor in Pilsen, and $47 left after sending his biweekly money home. He enrolled in the city colleges of Chicago, the community college system, accessible, affordable, and most critically, offering night and weekend classes. He registered for 2 courses in his first semester, Introduction to Accounting and English Composition. He paid with a payment plan that cost him $84 a month, which he recalculated his budget to absorb by eliminating the 3 times a week he'd been allowing himself to buy a cup of coffee. He told no one at first, not Fortunato, not Dale, not the other men in the apartment. This was not because he was ashamed. It was because he understood, with a wisdom beyond his years, that people's doubts about your dreams have a weight that attaches itself to you, and when you are only beginning, you cannot afford that weight. He studied on the bus. He studied on his break. He studied in the diner's back parking lot on his milk crate at 2 a.m. under the flickering lot light. He studied at the library on Saturday afternoons. He studied in the bathroom of the apartment at midnight when the only private light was the one over the sink. He got 4, sometimes 5 hours of sleep. He learned to let his body rest without his mind fully stopping, a kind of half-sleep that left him functional but never quite rested. His first semester, he got an A in accounting and a B+ in English composition. He allowed himself the coffee back. The second year was harder than the first, but harder in a different direction. The survival was established. He was no longer figuring out how to eat and pay rent. Now the difficulty was purely internal. It was the slow, relentless grind of building something when no one around you can see what you're building, when you have no external validation, when the only evidence that you're moving forward is the grades on papers that live in a folder under your floor blanket. He had a bad night in February of his second year. He had been studying for an intermediate accounting exam, a genuinely difficult subject, the kind where the concepts stack on top of each other, and if you misunderstand one layer, the whole structure gets shaky. And he had worked an overnight shift and then gone straight to a 4-hour study session at the library, and then to a 3-hour class and then back to work, and somewhere around 3 a.m. on the dish line, standing in the steam with his hands cracking from the hot water and industrial soap. He felt something inside him give way, not dramatically, quietly, which is almost worse. He stood there and thought, what am I doing? Not in the motivating way, in the collapsing way, the way the question means, is any of this real? Is this a story I am telling myself to survive? Will I still be standing at this sink in 5 years, in 10 years, my hands cracked, sending $200 home, the floor blanket, the flickering light? He didn't tell anyone about that night. He went home at 6 a.m. and lay down on his blanket and stared at the ceiling. He thought about his father's hands, the specific texture of them, the way the skin had toughened and split and toughened again over decades of bricklaying. He thought about his mother pushing the cart 3 kilometers in the dark. He thought about what it had cost for him to be here, the money borrowed from the neighbor, the 22 days in the desert, his mother's face memorizing him at the door. He got up at 9 a.m. He made himself a meal, rice and beans, the cheap faithful meal, and he opened his accounting textbook and he started again. That's not a dramatic story. It doesn't make a good movie scene. It's just a man who didn't quit, on a morning when quitting would have been completely understandable. And those moments, the uncinematic ones, the ones where nothing happens except that you choose to keep going, those are the actual architecture of every life that gets built. He passed the intermediate accounting exam with an 88. He told Dale about school in the 3rd year. It happened accidentally. Dale saw the textbook sticking out of Ernesto's bag during a slow hour and asked what it was. Ernesto told him. Dale stared at him for a long moment. CPA, Dale said, like a real accountant. Yes, Ernesto said. Dale was quiet for a moment. Then he said something Ernesto would remember for the rest of his life. I always thought you were smarter than this place. He didn't say it cruelly. He said it with a kind of wondering recognition, the way you might say it about a bird you'd assumed was part of the furniture and suddenly realized could fly. After that, Dale became an unexpected ally. He covered Ernesto's station during breaks without being asked. He stopped the kitchen radio on nights when Ernesto had an exam the next day and needed to study in the relative quiet of the back lot. He never talked about it directly, that wasn't Dale's way, but the accommodation was deliberate and consistent, and Ernesto recognized it for what it was, a form of belief, extended without ceremony, which is the most genuine kind. He told Fortunato that year 2. His cousin's reaction was more complicated. Fortunato looked at him with an expression that mixed admiration with something that might have been guilt. They had arrived in Chicago at different times for different reasons, and Fortunato had long since settled into a life that was stable but narrow, working in a warehouse, watching soccer on weekends, sending money home, asking no more of America than it had already agreed to give him. Ernesto's ambition made Fortunato feel something he didn't have a word for in English and chose not to examine too closely in Spanish. Just make sure you're not dreaming too big, Fortunato said. He meant it kindly. He really did. I'm not dreaming, Ernesto said. I'm studying. It was the most important distinction he knew. He transferred to Northeastern Illinois University after 3 semesters at city colleges, having completed his foundational coursework with a 3.7 GPA. NEIU was a public university with strong accounting and business programs and a significant Latino student population. Ernesto had researched it carefully, the way he researched everything, methodically and without romanticism. He applied for a Pell Grant and an Illinois State Scholarship. He was 23 years old by this point, technically an independent student for financial aid purposes, which paradoxically worked in his favor. He was still washing dishes at Rosie's. He had moved from the overnight shift to the 4 p.m. to midnight shift, which gave him mornings for classes and afternoons for studying. He moved from the floor blanket in Fortunato's apartment to a room he shared with one other person, a fellow student named Jerome, a 26-year-old black man from the South Side studying to be a social worker, for $380 a month. It was the first bed Ernesto had slept in since leaving Mexico. He lay in it the first night for a long time, not sleeping, just existing in the strange luxury of a mattress, looking at the ceiling. He thought about all the floors he had slept on. He thought about the number of people who had told him, without quite saying it directly, that the ceiling was where he belonged, that men like him looked up at ceilings from the floor. He thought about how wrong they were, and how much work it had taken to prove it, and how much more work remained. Jerome became his first real friend in America, not because they were similar, they weren't, in background or temperament, but because they recognized in each other the same fundamental thing, the stubborn refusal to accept the life that circumstances had planned for them. They studied together some nights at the kitchen table, Jerome with his social work textbooks and Ernesto with his accounting texts, 2 men in their mid-20s doing the work that most people around them had done at 18, and finding in each other's company the specific comfort of knowing you are not alone in your lateness to the starting line. Jerome called him A. Nobody had ever given Ernesto a nickname before. He found he liked it. You know what your problem is, Jerome said one night, looking up from a paper on childhood trauma intervention. What? You don't let yourself want anything out loud, like you're afraid that if you say what you're going for, somebody's gonna take it. Ernesto considered this. Where I come from, you don't say what you want until you have it. That's a poverty mindset, man. I don't mean that as an insult. I mean that's what poverty teaches you, hide your hopes because they're a liability. But you're not in that place anymore, not inside. Ernesto sat with that for a long time. Then he said quietly, the first time he'd said it to another human being, I want to own a firm, a financial services firm, for immigrants, people who are getting cheated because they don't know the system. Jerome looked at him. Say it louder. I want to own a firm. There you go, Jerome said, and went back to his paper. The CPA exam is 4 sections: financial accounting and reporting, auditing and attestation, regulation and business environment and concepts. Each section is typically taken separately, each requires months of dedicated preparation, and each has a pass rate that humbles even the most prepared candidates. Ernesto began his exam preparation in his final year at NEIU, purchasing used CPA review materials from a former student he found on a university message board, supplementing them with free resources from the library, creating his own flashcards and practice problems in notebooks he bought in bulk from a dollar store. He took the first section, FAR, Financial Accounting and Reporting, 4 months before graduating. It was a 4-hour exam at a Prometric testing center in the Loop. He sat in a cubicle with headphones that played white noise and a computer and a small whiteboard for scratch work, and he was so prepared that the preparation itself had become a kind of faith, not in any supernatural sense. Faith in the math, faith in the hours. Faith in the empirical fact that if you put enough work into a thing, the thing changes. He passed with a 79, the passing score was 75. He sat in his car. He had bought a used 2003 Honda Civic for $2,200 the previous year, the first vehicle he had ever owned, and he called his mother. She had a cell phone now, bought with the money he'd been sending home. His father's wrist had healed. Miguel's headaches had turned out to be a vision problem, corrected with glasses that cost $40. His mother answered on the second ring. Mama, he said, passé. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, of course you did, you are your grandfather's blood. He could do arithmetic faster than the market clock. He hadn't known this about his grandfather. He sat with it for a moment, this small inheritance of ability stretching back through generations, and felt connected to something larger than himself. He passed the remaining 3 sections over the next 18 months, working full-time, studying at nights and on weekends, failing the regulation section on his first attempt and retaking it 4 months later and passing with an 81. The failed attempt, the only exam he had ever failed in his adult life, produced 2 weeks of genuine crisis. He questioned everything. He went back to the milk crate in his mind, back to the flickering light, back to the 2 a.m. parking lot, and he asked himself whether this was where the road ended, whether he had been wrong about himself all along. He called Jerome, who was by then working at a social services non-profit on the south side, and they met for coffee, and Jerome said almost nothing, which was exactly right, because sometimes what a person needs is not advice, but the presence of someone who already knows they're going to get back up. He got back up, he always got back up. It was perhaps the most important thing about him. When Ernesto Vasquez became a licensed certified public accountant in the state of Illinois, he was 27 years old. He had been in the United States for 9 years. He had spent those 9 years washing dishes, sleeping on floors, studying on milk crates, surviving on 1 meal a day, sending money home to Oaxaca, and building brick by invisible brick, a structure that nobody could see except him. He was still washing dishes the day he got the letter confirming his license. He went to work that night, and he washed dishes with the same efficiency and the same focused quiet that he had brought to the work for 9 years. Dale asked him how it went. He showed him the letter. Dale read it slowly, his lips moving slightly over the official language, and when he looked up his eyes were doing something complicated. I knew it, Dale said. First night you showed up, I knew you weren't gonna be here long. I've been here 9 years, Dale. I know, I said, not long. 9 years isn't long for what you were doing. Ernesto smiled. He worked his shift. He washed the last rack of dishes at midnight. He untied his apron, folded it with the same neatness he brought to everything, and placed it on the counter. He never washed dishes professionally again. He got a job at a small accounting firm in Wicker Park, not the prestige firm on Michigan Avenue that he'd eventually worked toward, but a legitimate firm with real clients and real work, and a supervisor named Karen Pollock, who was, without sentimentality, the best professional mentor he would ever have. Karen was a 48-year-old Jewish woman from Skokie who had started her own firm at 30, and sold it to a larger company at 45, and stayed on as senior manager. She had seen plenty of young CPAs who were technically brilliant and professionally immature, and she had also seen, more rarely, the kind of person who combined ability with the right kind of hunger. She recognized it in Ernesto within the first month. She pushed him in the way that good mentors push, not past your limits but exactly up to them, which is how limits expand. She gave him client work that was slightly beyond his current level. She corrected him directly and without cushioning when he made errors, which he found deeply respectful because it meant she took him seriously. She also, and this mattered enormously, introduced him to people. She brought him to professional events. She said his name in rooms he wouldn't yet have been able to enter on his own. She was performing a kind of quiet advocacy that he wouldn't fully understand until years later, when he found himself doing the same for others. He worked at that firm for 3 years, absorbing everything, not just the technical accounting skills which grew rapidly, but the softer architecture of professional life. How to speak in client meetings, how to translate complex financial concepts into plain language, how to build trust with people who were placing their financial lives in your hands. He discovered that he was extraordinarily good at the last part. He had a quality, born, he suspected, from years of navigating a world where he had to read rooms carefully and communicate across language barriers, a quality of paying complete attention to whoever was speaking. People felt heard by him. That is rarer than technical skill and worth more. He got his green card during this period, through an employment-based process that Karen helped him navigate and whose complexity was, in profound irony, the kind of thing his future firm would one day help hundreds of others survive. The day he received his permanent resident status, he took himself out to dinner, alone, at a real restaurant, the kind he had bussed tables near but never sat inside. He ordered the most expensive thing on the menu, which was a steak he barely tasted because he was so overwhelmed by the strange, enormous, complicated emotion of the moment. He was not an American citizen. He was not yet where he was going, but he was here, legally and permanently, and nobody could take that from him. He called his parents after dinner. His father answered, unusual, since it was usually Consuelo who handled the phone. Ernesto, his father said. His voice had gotten older. Ernesto had missed that happening in real time. Papa, I got my green card today. A long silence. Then Rodrigo Vasquez, who had never once in Ernesto's life told him he was proud of him in direct words, because that wasn't how his generation of men spoke, it wasn't how the culture handed those things, said, "Come home and visit us. I want to see the man you've become." It was the same thing. It meant exactly the same thing as asterisk, "I'm proud of you." Ernesto understood. Soon, Papa, I will, soon. He founded Vasquez Financial Services on a Tuesday in March, in a second-floor office above a Mexican restaurant in Pilsen, with $11,000 in savings, a second-hand desk, a laptop, a printer, and a professional liability insurance policy he had researched for 3 weeks before purchasing. He was 31 years old. He had been in the United States for 13 years. He had washed dishes for 9 of them. He chose Pilsen deliberately. He could have found an office in Wicker Park closer to his previous firm, or in the Loop, where the professional weight of the address would have said something about his aspirations. But his aspirations were specific, and his people were specific, and his people were in Pilsen and Little Village and Humboldt Park and Cicero, the neighborhoods where immigrants worked and lived and navigated a financial system built in a language and a logic that wasn't designed for them. He had seen, during his years in Chicago, what happened to people who didn't understand the system. He had seen Fortunato pay a tax preparer who ran a storefront operation out of a gas station, a man with no credentials and no accountability, and lose $1,200 to incorrect filing. He had seen a woman in his apartment building get taken apart by a predatory lender who offered her a business loan with terms she couldn't read. He had seen men work for years under the table and have no financial record, no credit, no legal standing when something went wrong. He had seen, over and over again, how financial ignorance, which was really just lack of access to clear information, translated into real material suffering for real people. He was going to change that, not with charity. He believed deeply that people needed to be served with professionalism and respect, not pity, but with competence, with knowledge transferred honestly and completely, with the same quality of service that wealthy clients received on Michigan Avenue, delivered to people who needed it far more desperately. The first year was almost nothing. 6 clients, all referrals from people he'd known in his early Chicago years. He did their taxes, their business filings, their bookkeeping. He charged fair rates and explained everything twice, once in professional terms and once in plain language, and often once in Spanish. He was meticulous in a way that approached obsession. Every return was reviewed 3 times. Every client meeting was prepared for thoroughly. He was building something, and he understood that in the building's earliest stages, every single brick is load-bearing. Word spread the way it spreads in tight communities, organically, through trust, through one person telling another, "Go see Ernesto. He's one of us and he actually knows what he's doing." By the end of year 2, he had 40 clients. By the end of year 3, he had 110 and had hired his first employee, a young woman named Daniela. a second-generation Mexican-American who had just completed her accounting degree and who reminded him, in her focused quiet, of himself. He trained Daniela the way Karen had trained him, with high standards, direct feedback, and the implicit message that he expected excellent things from her because he could see she was capable of them. He told her on her first day the same thing Dale had said to him years earlier, repurposed. "You're too smart to stay small. This firm is going to grow, and I intend for you to grow with it." She looked at him with the expression of someone trying to decide whether to believe something they desperately want to be true. "How do you know?" she asked. "Same way someone knew it about me once," he said. "You just see it." The growth of Vasquez Financial Services over the following years was not the explosive kind that makes for exciting business school case studies. It was the steady, compound kind, the kind built on reputation and referral, and the relentless delivery of genuine value. Ernesto added services gradually, always staying within his competence and hiring to expand it. Business consulting, payroll services, financial planning for small business owners, immigration-related tax services for which he developed a specific expertise that became one of the firm's most important differentiators. He moved offices twice, from the second floor above the restaurant in Pilsen to a proper suite in Little Village at year 4, and then to a 2-floor office in the South Loop at year 7, though he kept satellite office hours in Pilsen and Little Village because his clients lived there, and he was not going to make them follow him upward as the firm grew. He became a citizen at 34. The naturalization ceremony was at a federal courthouse in the Loop, in a room with 200 other people from 40 different countries. He had prepared himself to feel triumphant. What he actually felt, standing there reciting the oath, was something quieter and larger, a kind of enormous gratitude that had no specific target. That was directed at everything at once. At the country that had let him in despite the difficulty of his entry, at the city that had provided the library and the community college and the public university, at Dale and Karen and Jerome, and his parents and his grandfather, who could add faster than the market clock. He called his father that night. His father answered immediately, as if he'd been waiting. "Papa," Ernesto said, "soy ciudadano americano." The silence this time was different from the other silences. It was the silence of a man who had counted coins on a table by lamplight, so that his son could stand in a federal courthouse and say those words. It was the silence of a man who had sent his boy into the desert, with $300 borrowed from a neighbor and 30-odd years of love packed into a handshake, and who was now sitting in a kitchen in Oaxaca hearing what that investment had become. "Come home," his father said. "Come home now, I want to shake your hand." He went home that year for the first time in 16 years. He will not talk in detail about that visit because some things belong entirely to the people who lived them. What he will say is that his father's hands were exactly as he remembered them, rough and wide and certain, and the handshake they exchanged in the doorway of the house where he had learned to count coins was something he will carry until he dies. Vasquez Financial Services crossed $1 million in annual revenue in its 8th year. It was managing $40 million in client assets by year 10. It had a staff of 16, of whom 11 were first or second-generation immigrants, of whom 4, including Daniela, now a senior manager, were on a partnership track. It had served over 2,000 individual and small business clients, the overwhelming majority of them immigrants or first-generation Americans. It had recovered, through audits of previous fraudulent or incompetent tax preparation, over $800,000 in wrongly overpaid taxes and fees for clients who hadn't known they'd been cheated. The firm got written up in Crane's Chicago business in year 9. The journalist asked Ernesto what he attributed his success to. He gave several answers: preparation, mentorship, a clear focus on an underserved market. But the truest answer was the one he gave last, almost as an afterthought. "I never stopped studying," he said. "The night I washed my last dish, I went home and opened a book. I still open a book every night. The learning doesn't stop because you succeeded. The learning is why you succeeded. And if you stop learning, the success stops too." He was 43 years old now, and the man who had once hidden his textbooks under dirty rags no longer hid anything. He spoke at city colleges of Chicago's graduation ceremonies. He funded 2 full-ride scholarships annually for immigrant students pursuing accounting or finance degrees. He had quietly paid back the $300 his father had borrowed from the neighbor, with interest, decades late, to a family that no longer needed it, but was moved beyond words by the gesture. He had hired Jerome's nephew, who had struggled to find work after minor legal trouble, and given him a genuine chance that turned into a career. He had sent money for Miguel's daughter's school supplies every year since she was 5 years old. He had, in the aggregate, become the person he had needed when he first arrived, the person who knew the system, and was willing to share that knowledge without condescension or exploitation. He still drove the Honda Civic sometimes. Not always. He had a better car, a practical German sedan that he'd bought used with 4 years of depreciation already absorbed. But sometimes on nights when he stayed late at the office going over client files, he'd drive the old Civic home through Pilsen, past Rosie's diner, past the library, past the bus stop where he'd counted change in the mornings to decide whether he could afford the ride. He drove slowly. Not out of nostalgia exactly. Out of respect. Those streets had been his university. The cold and the hunger and the flickering parking lot light had been his teachers. He did not want to forget what they had taught him. One evening in late October, he parked outside Rosie's diner, still there, still the same neon sign, same 24-hour coffee, and went in. He sat at the counter. A young woman he didn't recognize brought him coffee. He looked at the pass-through to the kitchen and saw a man at the dish station, young, probably early 20s, moving fast, focused in that specific way that people are focused when they are somewhere they need to be somewhere else. He watched him for a while. He drank his coffee slowly. When the young man came out to take a break, Ernesto nodded at him. The young man nodded back, the universal nod of people who are in the same space but have no particular reason to speak. "You just started here?" Ernesto asked. 3 months, the young man said. His English had the same precise, careful quality that Ernesto's had once had, the English of someone who learned it from television and textbooks rather than from childhood. "Where are you from?" "Honduras." Ernesto nodded. He took a card from his jacket pocket, the firm's card, clean and professional, his name on it with his CPA designation, and placed it on the counter. "I washed dishes in this kitchen for 9 years, he said. "If you ever decide you want to know where that road can go, come find me." The young man looked at the card, then he looked at Ernesto, then he looked back at the card with the expression of someone trying to do a calculation that doesn't quite make sense yet. "You're serious," the young man said. "I never joke about work," Ernesto said. He left a $20 tip on a $4 coffee, stood up, buttoned his coat, and walked out into the Chicago night. There is a version of this story that people want to be told differently. They want the miracle. They want the overnight reversal, the single moment where everything changed, the investor who appeared out of nowhere, or the lucky break that turned the tide. They want the story to be about fate because fate is easier to believe in than labor. If success is fate, then your current position is also fate, and neither thing is your fault or your responsibility. Fate is comfortable. Fate lets everyone off the hook. But Ernesto Vasquez's story is not a story about fate. It is a story about decisions made in the dark when nobody was watching. About a textbook held together with rubber bands under flickering parking lot light. About 4 minutes of celebration on a bridge over the Chicago River, and then crossing the bridge and continuing to walk. About the kind of work that doesn't announce itself, that doesn't trend, that doesn't get witnessed. The work of one human being deciding, over and over and over again, on ordinary mornings and exhausted midnights to continue. The lesson is not complicated. It never is. The complicated thing is not the lesson, it's the living of it. You are not too old, you are not too late. You are not too poor, too foreign, too uneducated, too broken, too far behind to begin. You are exactly where every person who has ever built something real once stood, at the beginning in the dark with less than you need and more than you think. The question is not whether you can. The question that matters, the only question that has ever mattered, is whether you will pick up the book. Whether you will sit down on the milk crate. Whether you will read in the flickering light. Whether, when the light goes out, you will keep reading anyway. Ernesto Vasquez is still in Chicago. He still calls his mother every Sunday. His father's hands are the same. The Honda Civic has 212,000 miles on it and he refuses to sell it. He opens a book every night before he sleeps. He has not stopped studying.